Let me start by thanking the members of Congress who traveled here today during the district work periods, as well as the congressional staff who have worked hard and been tracking this issue and helping us to put this forum together. This topic is too important for Congress and Donald Trump to wait until next year. We're honored to have with us three of our nation's top experts on this issue. Ambassador Norm Eisen serves as visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and was the chief ethics lawyer for President Barack Obama. Richard Painter is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and served previously as the chief ethics counsel to President George W. Bush. And Stephen Gillers is a professor at the New York University School of Law. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. We really appreciate your service, we appreciate your expertise, and we appreciate your advice on these very, very important issues. We've asked our panelists to address three basic questions today. Three questions. First, what should Donald Trump do now that he has been elected president? Previous presidents have liquidated their assets and placed them into a blind trust run by an independent entity to avoid even the appearance of conflicts. But President-elect Trump refuses to do this. Instead, he says that as president, he cannot have conflicts of interest. So he will keep his ownership interest in these companies and just let his sons run the business. Second question, what are the potential negative repercussions for both President-elect Trump and our country if he chooses not to follow the same course of action as presidents who came before him? And when could the emoluments clause be implicated? And when could other conflicts of interest appear? Now, third question, if President-elect Trump refuses to take these steps, then what should Congress do? How should Congress exercise its responsibility under the Constitution to conduct robust oversight and act as an independent check on the executive branch? What documents should we seek to verify his claims? And what hearings should we hold to investigate conflicts that may arise? The task before Congress is extremely daunting. Our nation has never before had a president with such a vast global entanglements and financial conflicts of interest. Our nation has also not had a president, at least in many decades, who has engaged in such extreme secrecy, including refusing to let the American people see his tax returns. As we begin today's discussion, let me make one thing clear. I could care less if Donald Trump wants to keep his name on his television show, Celebrity Apprentice. Some people may say that is beneath the president, but that is not what this forum is all about. What I do care about are the grave conflicts of interest that are interwoven throughout President-elect Trump's entire global corporate enterprise. Based on press reports, he has about 111 financial entities in 20 different countries and territories. For example, I care about the scope of President-elect Trump's financial dealings with entities in Russia, a country that interfered in our presidential election, and according to 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. I care about the hundreds of millions of dollars that President-elect Trump owes to foreign entities like Deutsche Bank, a bank that engaged in massive fraud in the sale of mortgage-backed securities, according to the United States Justice Department. I care about the 60-year lease for President-elect Trump's new luxury hotel here in Washington, D.C., that will be breached the moment he steps into the Oval Office unless he completely divests his ownership interests, according to the United States General Services Administration. I care about government officials in Bahrain, China, Turkey, Argentina, Singapore, and elsewhere who may buy up entire floors of hotel rooms, pay higher rents at Trump Tower, lower interest rates on loans, speed up permits for development projects, or take all kinds of other inappropriate actions to ingratiate themselves with this new administration. Those are the things we care about. At the simplest level, I care about every instance in which a foreign entity will see an opportunity to bestow illegal favors on the president that could degrade our democracy. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This is bigger than our president-elect. This is bigger than this moment. This is about our democracy and the laws that go with it. This is exactly the concern the founding fathers had when they wrote the emoluments clause into the Constitution. It is our obligation as members of Congress to identify and hopefully prevent these types of constitutional violations. Finally, I believe strongly that this should be a bipartisan effort. I've said that over and over and over again. We simply cannot afford to allow it to be partisan. I wrote a letter to Chairman of the Oversight Committee, Jason Chaffetz, on November 14th, a month ago today, asking for a bipartisan review of President-elect Trump's financial arrangements. He never responded. On November 28th, all the Democrats on the committee again asked him to conduct this review. And again, we had what? No response. Do not even request a meeting with the Trump transition team officials. Unfortunately, we were left with no option but to hold today's forum ourselves, although we invited our Republican colleagues to attend. Let me close by explaining why I believe the Republicans should care about this issue. It's because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Of course, it is our constitutional duty to serve as a check on the executive branch. But even from a purely political perspective, do Republicans really want the head of their party to be dogged for the next 4 years by conflicts of interest? We'd hope that President-elect Trump would shed light on this issue tomorrow. Several weeks ago, he said he was going to hold a major press conference to explain to the American people the approach he planned to take and to detail the various legal documents he was drawing up. But at the last minute, he canceled his press conference. So now we have no idea when he plans to answer these very important questions. This is a very worrisome sign. However, it makes today's forum all the more important. I hope we can hear today in a clear and compelling way why addressing these problems now instead of letting them fester is better for both President-elect Trump and the American people. President-elect Trump says he will do what the law requires. He says he will do what the law requires, but that should not be the minimum standard for President of the United States of America. Of course, we should follow the letter of the law, but he should promote its spirit as well. This is the same advice that the Department of Justice and the Office of Government Ethics has provided to every president over the past 4 decades. With that, let me turn to our 3 panelists for their statements, and then we will have a questions and answer session with the members who are here. And to the members, what we will do is each member will have 7 minutes, will be timed. And I'm asking I know you all have a lot to say, panelists. We're going to get to a lot of your testimony in the question and answer, but we would ask you to restrict your opening comments to 5 minutes, if you will. We will begin with Mr. Richard Painter.
Thank you very much, Congressman. There we go. Thank you very much, Congressman. The answer to your first question is quite clear. President-elect Trump should divest himself of any and all business interests that create conflicts of interest for him as president. And that means divesting himself of ownership as well as management. It does not suffice for him to retain ownership and turn management over to his children or anyone else. Most all of the conflict of interest concerns and laws that we have would pertain to his ownership of the business enterprises. He must part with that. And then invest the money in conflict-free assets, treasury securities, mutual funds. There are many conflict-free assets that he can choose from, or hand part of the money or all of it over to a blind trustee who will administer a blind trust that complies with the regulations of the Office of Government Ethics. That is what every other president in recent memory has done, and that is what he must do as president. If he does not, the repercussions are serious. And I do not have time now to discuss all of them. I'm happy to address my many concerns in the question and answer period. But one of the most grave threats to American democracy is the infiltration of our government by foreign powers. The founders worried about this. They worried about France and England and Russia and other countries that would seek to influence the United States government. That is why we have a provision in the Constitution that says the president must be a natural-born citizen. We heard a lot about that one over the past several years. And the demand, I thought, quite frankly, embarrassing and racist, that suggested that President Barack Obama was not a natural-born citizen, and the insistence of, among others, President-elect Trump, that he produce a birth certificate. I've brought mine, just in case someone wants to question. Now, much more important than that provision that applies only to the president, that he must be a natural-born citizen, is the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. This is not some arcane provision. All it says is no foreign government payoffs for anybody holding a position of trust with the United States government, not just the president. We do not want foreign governments paying off our government officials. The founders understood that problem. They had been used to being under the thumb of a powerful European country, England, Great Britain. Parts of the United States have been ruled by France, Spain, other countries. We wanted to have our own country, run by American leaders who would be responsible to the American people. That's why we had the Emoluments Clause. The word emolumentum in Latin refers to profits. We do not want to have government officials who are profiteering off dealing with foreign governments, and that includes companies controlled by foreign governments. I have heard the ridiculous argument made that, well, if you take your emoluments through a corporation or some other shell entity, it's somehow okay. Well, I don't think that's the way we should be taking bribes, emoluments, or any other illegal payment. The Constitution clearly prohibits it. So we have parts of the Trump business empire that are dealing with foreign governments. Every time the diplomats stay in the hotel or the government of Bahrain books a party in a hotel, we have bank loans from the Bank of China, banks controlled by a foreign government. And the list goes on. And we don't know about all of them because we haven't seen the tax returns. And you're not going to find out all the emoluments on the Form 278. Maybe we ought to have a new schedule on 278. List your unconstitutional emoluments in Schedule E, but we don't do that. So we don't know what's going on with respect to payments being made to the Trump business empire. Well, it's okay until January 20. But the problem is the electors have a decision to make. And President-elect Trump is putting them in a very, very unfair position, telling the electors that they should be voting for him for president when he has not assured them that he is going to be complying with the Constitution the minute he is sworn into office. I don't know whether, if this problem isn't solved, whether the Chief Justice can even show up to give him the oath of office. The president-elect needs to address the constitutional concern first and foremost. And then there are all the other conflicts of interest that I could discuss with you in the question and answer period. I have written a lot on the investment banking industry and the scandals that led up to 2008. And the last thing we need is a president who is indebted to the large banks when he's supposed to be regulating banks, unless we want to just go through that whole circus again. Then there's a bribery and gratuity risk of quid pro quo discussions, and the security risk when you have the name of the President of the United States on top of a building in an area of the world where there's a high terrorism risk. Who's going to pay for that? The foreign government, or do we pay for it? Well, we would discuss all of that later. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Norm Eisen.
I want to thank you for inviting me and inviting this bipartisan panel, Congressman Cummings. I want to thank the other congressmen, some of whom I've had the pleasure of working with before. I do want to begin in answering your question, what should Donald Trump do now, by emphasizing that it is a question of the utmost bipartisan urgency. And in my now 25 years of working on these issues in Washington, I have seen a bipartisan groundswell. Professor Painter and I were on a letter that was written that included last week addressing the question of what Donald Trump should do, which is to do what every president has done for the past 4 decades since this body passed the 1978 Ethics in Government Act, which is to set up a true qualified blind trust without respect to whether it's legally mandatory, and put their assets in there, let an independent trustee, not a family member. By definition, an independent trustee is a non-family member. Let that trustee tomorrow start to worry about all these financial entanglements. Let Donald Trump focus on his job as president-elect and then liquidate those assets and put them behind that big, beautiful wall, an ethics wall, where he doesn't know what's being done with his funds. And we laid that out in a letter last week, and I was so pleased that right, left, and center came forward to support that solution. We had 2 former Republican governors. We had 4 of your distinguished former Republican colleagues in the House of Representatives. We had not only liberal and progressive and centrist watchdog and other advocacy groups, but conservative ones. My friend Peter Schweizer of the Government Accountability Institute, one of the most severe critics of Secretary Clinton during this campaign, signed on to that letter. And so did John Pudner, whose group Take Back Our Republic is a Tea Party aligned group, and John has deep relationships there, and others from the right also coming together to answer your first question. What should Donald J. Trump do now? The president-elect should do a true blind trust. What are the negative repercussions that will flow if he elects not to do that, as seems to be the case? I don't want to minimize the fact that the president-elect has taken some baby steps forward in addressing this issue. First, he said, president can't have conflicts. Then he said, well, I have visible conflicts. So he's admitted that there's some kind of a conflict issue in tweets. And then yesterday he says, well, I won't do new deals. Unfortunately, when you look more closely at what that means, all he means apparently is that he won't do brand new projects from scratch, but of course all the deal making in the existing projects will continue. And that is a lot of transactions and negotiations and renegotiations every day. The repercussions, if the president-elect continues with this, are profound. There are serious legal repercussions, and you heard from Professor Painter about the emoluments clause. We are faced with the extraordinary situation, should the president-elect continue on this course, that on the first day that he's in office, indeed the first hour, the first minute after he takes his oath of office, he will have these flow of foreign government payments. You don't have to look abroad to see him. You can look at his hotel just a few blocks from us, which is aggressively seeking foreign government business. And every one of those dollars that hits the hotel come January 20th will be in violation of the United States Constitution, and that is exactly what the framers were concerned about, because it's not only gifts and presents that create a risk of distorting judgment and causing a president to make decisions based on his pocketbook and his relationships instead of the best interests of the United States. It's business deals, and in fact, business deals can sometimes provide a much larger conduit through which these benefits, that's all emoluments means, you should think of it just as benefits coming to the president-elect from a foreign government. These emoluments, these benefits can flow in much larger amounts under the cover of business deals. It is clearly covered by the Emoluments Clause. This body, finally and very briefly, needs to exercise its oversight authority. I hope that will be in a bipartisan way, and I just want to reiterate, just as this is a bipartisan panel, and as I know you've reached out, as we were pleased you would do to have others here, we're available to those of all parties and any party to answer these questions and take calls every day from Democrats and Republicans alike. Consider legislation as well, for example, to define emoluments violations, and of course, an important role sometimes for Congress, members joining in litigation. And finally, there are express remedies in the Constitution of high crimes and misdemeanors, but let us hope that that expediency will not become necessary.
Thank you very much. Professor Stephen Gillers.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. By virtue of going last, I can speak less. I agree with my colleagues here that Mr. Trump has to sell his interest in the Trump Organization. It's the only way to avoid the conflicts that will otherwise ensue. It may be worthwhile to ask, why do we forbid conflicts in the first place? Right? That's the background question. And the answer is, we forbid conflicts out of respect for the trust of the American public. That's the key. Respect for the American public. The public has a right to full confidence that decisions that are made by a government official are made solely in the interest of the public and the government and not for private gain. Confidence that that is so. It doesn't mean that it will not be so. What we're protecting is public trust. Consequently, it is important that Mr. Trump sell his interest. It can be done. I've seen statements that, well, it's too complicated. New York lawyers can unwind his interest in his organization within 6 months. It can't be done overnight, but it can be done quickly. The conflicts of interest statute does not apply to him. We know that. He and the vice president are exempt, and I think that is correct. I would not support amending that statute to include the president and vice president. There are reasons why they are exempt. So he does not have to, under the statute, do this, but he should do it in order to encourage the public trust in his decisions. Not so for the Emoluments Clause. That does, as Norm says, apply to him. It applies to all government officials. You can look at the Emoluments Clause as a conflict of interest rule raised to a constitutional standard. It forbids a certain kind of conflict, conflicts that are between the president's public duty and the interest he may or may not have in foreign investments. That's what it does. On day one, as Norm says, he will be in violation of that clause. Selling his interest in the Trump Organization will avoid that. In the interim, he needs to do something until that windup can occur. Blind trust, I may disagree here with my colleagues. If we're talking about a blind trust for liquid assets where he will not know from week to week what he owns, that's fine. But you cannot have a blind trust for the non-liquid assets in the Trump organization. He knows what he owns, and even though around the edges that may change from month to month, essentially he knows what he owns. And so it cannot be blind. I have also seen calls for transparency, but blind trust and transparency are in some tension, because if there's transparency, it's not blind to anyone, including the president. And so I don't see blind trust as a useful concept here unless the assets are changed to liquid assets. Yes, there are other statutes that apply. There are the gratuity statutes, the bribery statutes, the insider trading laws, because he'll get a lot of information as president that others do not have, and he is forbidden to trade on that information. Congress imposed that duty on itself a few years ago. We should probably also talk about the children, because we may disagree on what the adult children can or should do, and what we can expect of President-elect Trump's conduct toward the adult children going forward. But I'll stop within my time and invite questions about that.
You were finished?
I'm finished.
That's so unusual up here.
I went last.
We're going to start with Mr. Connolly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cummings, and thank you for hosting this forum, and thank you to our guests for being here today. My approach to this, and I will urge it upon the President-elect, is this question. I mean, in the Watergate hearings, Howard Baker kept on saying, what did the President know, and when did he know it? That was the dispositive question. To me, the dispositive question in all of this is, what could go wrong with that? So, you know, I was in Turkey for a NATO meeting last month, driving around Istanbul to our hotel from the airport, and I look up and there's Trump Tower. Now, the Turkish government, after the coup, has demanded the United States extradite a certain figure founded the Convenes movement who lives in Pennsylvania. Now, what could go wrong with that applies here. If the United States under a Trump administration were in fact to acquiesce to the request for extradition, absent liquidation of assets, it seems to me that you are always subject now to the speculation, true or untrue, that you cave to the Turkish government because you've got holdings there that you want to protect. You've got relationships you built as a developer. And by adding a Secretary of State who's an oil magnate, you've compounded that set of questions. And so I don't see how you get around this. And let me start with the emolument clause, because that's a big academic word these days, emolument. It may have meant something in the 18th century. I'm not sure it means a lot today. But let me read it. I learned this from John Sarbanes' dad, Paul. Always go to the original text. So let me read it. No person holding any office or profit or trust shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any person, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. Ambassador Normeisen or Professor Painter, how does that apply here? What's that? In plain English, what is that telling us about this situation?
Congressman, it in simple English it says that the framers of our Constitution and the founders of our country wanted there to be a wall between any benefits of any kind hitting the President of the United States' pocket and his official duties. So that is.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt. Does that mean even private profit from holdings you had before you got elected?
The President, from foreign governments, the president needs to be absolutely screened off from these kind of foreign government funds. And even, other presidents, even without the foreign aspect, that's why they use the blind trust. And I agree with Professor Gillers. This is not to hold the Trump towers. This is for the trustee to liquidate and put the things behind the wall. Presidents go to these conflict-free investments that are unknown even to them, so there's not even the question, the appearance that you point out. How much more so when there is a constant stream of benefits? Think of emoluments as just being benefits of any kind. I believe it can include permits, and we've had disturbing allegations of Trump projects abroad being restarted, the permitting process being restarted by foreign governments. It can include trademarks. We've had press reports of efforts to get additional trademarks from foreign governments during the campaign. Anything of benefit from a foreign government that might distort a judgment. The framers were terrified of the exact situation we find ourselves headed towards.
And so, if I may, and I know you want to comment, Professor, and I want to ask you a question about Russia, but in other words, it's a fairly all-encompassing, and I might add, it isn't buried in footnote 43 of the Constitution. It is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8. Article 1.
If you have any doubt about the breadth of it, look at those words at the end that you read, of any kind whatsoever.
Whatever. Professor Painter.
Monumentum, as I understand it in Latin, was a reference to profit, or the cut that the person who's running the mill would take out of the grain if you brought your grain to the mill. We do not want anybody, it's not just the president, anybody holding a position of trust with the United States government to be getting such profits from dealing with foreign governments or companies controlled by foreign governments. This is absolutely critical, and that's the constitutional issue. But your first example raised something about his building in Turkey, and that may or may not be covered by the Emoluments Clause, depending on where they are.
That's a separate issue.
Separate issue,
That's
but
right.
it is a serious issue.
And that's what I worry about. Every decision made with respect to a foreign government could be tainted in the eyes of some, if not many, because you haven't addressed the issue of liquidation.
Absolutely right, Congressman. Where would we be today if President Franklin Roosevelt had a Roosevelt Tower in downtown Berlin and in downtown Frankfurt and hundreds of millions of dollars outstanding from Deutsche Bank?
Exactly.
Some of us wouldn't be here today, and the rest of us might be speaking German.
So
this is critically important.
I'm going to sneak one more example in here with what time I have left in terms of what could go wrong with that. But Professor Painter, I'm going to address this to you. But before I do, you were former associate counsel to President George W. Bush.
Yes, I was.
That's a Republican president.
Well, yes.
Thank you. Because this is not a partisan issue, as I think you put out in your testimony, but I thought your own credential underscores that.
Well, I'm trying to figure out if Donald Trump is going to be a Republican president.
This is about our country. So let's ask about Russia, because Professor Gillers talked about the children. Maybe the answer here is just hand it over to the children. Now, the fact that one bleeds into the other is of concern to me. Recently, we had the visit with the president-elect with the Prime Minister of Japan, and one of the president-elect's children sat in the meeting. So immediately suggesting there's not going to be a firewall. But let's go to Russia for a minute. First of all, I think all three of you would agree, would you not, that we don't really know what the holdings are in Russia because he hasn't released his tax returns. Is that a fair statement?
That is very fair.
All right. So Donald Trump on July 26 about Russia tweeted, and I quote, "For the record, I have zero, all caps, investments in Russia," unquote. Well, that seems to settle it, except his son, Donald Trump Jr., who apparently will be running the day-to-day business, said, and I quote on this subject, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia," unquote. How do we square one with the other, and doesn't that kind of demonstrate that handing it all over to the children is the solution?
Yes, Russia is a serious concern. Between the Russia and the Soviet Union, there's been decades of trying to infiltrate American politics by appealing to extremist groups. With the Soviet Union, it was the American Communist Party and those on the far left. Of course, Senator McCarthy and others have made much more out of that than there was, but there was an attempt to destabilize our government from using the far left. And now we see that there is an attempt to use the far right. I am on some email list. They somehow got my email from Bush alumni or somewhere, receiving emails from somebody who's constantly telling me how Putin is running the great white power and is going to restore the power of the white race. I mean, this is, he's appealing to the most extreme and dangerous elements in our society. I think this is an effort to destabilize our country. I am very concerned about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings, and I want to tell you much. I appreciate you bringing us together for this very important hearing, and thank you, gentlemen, for testifying. I wanted at the outset to mention, I understand from my former law professor, Larry Tribe, that Ambassador Eisen and Mr. Painter are working on an elaborate discussion of the Emoluments Clause. Is there any chance that can be released this week? Because I know there's great interest among members, among electors, among others, to see that analysis as soon as possible.
Congressman, as soon as we finish, we're going to go back and put on our, sharpen our pencils and get back to work. We'll do our best to get it out. We know that there's an urgent need.
Well, thank you. There's tremendous interest among all the members of Congress in reading that analysis. With respect to the Emoluments Clause, I wanted to delve a little further into the role of the children. That is, the suggestion by Mr. Trump that he can excise himself from the business-making part of Trump enterprises and give it off to the kids. Is that adequate under the Emoluments Clause? The president is obviously not going to cut himself off from his own children. He knows what businesses the family has now. He knows where they're located. If the family merely the kids take full control of the business, is that somehow satisfactory?
Well, Congressman, if he is going to actually transfer ownership to the children, as well as management, give it to the children, he'd have to pay something, I believe, called a gift tax, and I don't believe he really likes paying taxes, so he may not want to explore that option. Just giving management to the children while he holds on to the ownership solves none of these problems. If he actually gives it all to the children, pays the gift tax, it might solve some of the legal problems, but the appearances would still reek to high heaven.
Well, under the Emoluments Clause, even if he gifted it to the children, the fact that he knows what a foreign government may do will inure to his family's benefit, would you consider that a violation of the Emoluments Clause?
In spirit, it may be, that would be up for the House of Representatives to decide. That's who is going to enforce the Emoluments Clause when it involves the President of the United States.
Can I speak to that? The children are adults. They're not government employees. If they are independent of their father, that is, there's no crosstalk, I don't think we can ask them to give up their careers or their work with the Trump organization. You know, we look for rules to against improper motives, but rules about everything. Sometimes you just have on self-restraint and decency. And I think that the children have a right as they see fit. Now, there is a big problem with the children because there isn't a wall between the children and their father. And the problem is that insofar as the children or the son-in-law are conferring with Mr. Trump about issues that come before him, they have they're in both sides of the divide. They've straddled the private and the public. This is really important because they don't hold an office, they don't get a salary, they don't have a title, so they are not subject to the conflicts of interest statute. And they are not subject, as the president-elect will be, to the Emoluments Clause. So it's a kind of stealth position that they're in. And I think we have to defer and trust to good behavior if there really is a recognized wall between the president-elect and the children. But apparently there is not, as we've seen so far, and there's no reason to think there will be after January 20th. I don't know what the solution to that may be, other than this, and you should explore it, and that is, the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution allows you to enforce provisions of the Constitution, including the emoluments clause. So one can imagine legislation that enforces the policies behind the emoluments clause. Now, getting that legislation adopted is another challenge, not my area, it's your problem, but one would hope it could be done. And that legislation can address both the president's position and the position of relatives of the president who are serving as confidants of the president.
Let me drill down a little further on a different point on the emoluments clause, and that is, I would imagine that the argument that the president-elect will make with respect, for example, to his hotel, and I have to preface this by saying I have enormous skepticism about a president-elect who, in the last throes of the election, was nonetheless out there pumping his hotel business, that he's somehow going to stop promoting the family business when he takes the oath of office. But I imagine his argument will be, as long as the hotel charges foreign customers fair market value, it's not a gift. If they were paying over fair market value, it might be a gift. If they're paying fair market value, it's not a gift. What's your response to that, as well as to the risk that foreign powers book rooms there and tell the president about it as a way of securing his beneficence?
On the first word in the emoluments clause, you're correct, Congressman. It's if they're paying fair market value, it's not a present, but it is an emolument. The emolument, the word emolument is paired with present because it was the intent. It says presents, emoluments of any kind, whatever. It was the intent both to capture things given and things earned. In other words, to capture the whole scope. So it is true on the present side. And that makes sense if you think about it from a policy perspective, because, for example, at the hotel, we're already seeing a huge uptick in business by foreign governments, and one diplomat even told the newspapers quite openly, of course I want to be able to tell the president, I love your new hotel. That is the kind of, look, one compliment from, I was an ambassador, so I know even if it comes from the ambassadorial level, is probably not going to sway judgment. But we're talking about a flood of these emoluments, some of them in very large form. So I do believe that those are interdicted by the Constitution. If I may just add on the kids' point that you raised, which is a profound one, nobody wants to ruin the lives of these kids. But Mr. Trump has the largest responsibility in the world coming up, and it's incumbent upon him to focus on the interests of the United States. All the more reason he can do it with one stroke of a pen and with one piece of paper, do what the other presidents have done, appoint an independent trustee, turn everything over to the trustee, let the trustee sort those issues out. The president should have the interests of the United States first.
My last question, I want to follow up on Mr. Connolly's line of questioning, and that is, on the Intelligence Committee, I obviously have profound concerns about the president-elect's statements about Russia meddling in our elections and the conflicts of interest that the president-elect may have with Russia, that his Secretary of State nominee, who spent many years cultivating a relationship with Putin, has with Russia, that his national security advisor may have with Russia. And without the tax returns, we don't know the extent of his financial involvement with Russia. Similarly, with respect to Turkey, we've already seen several iterations of swings in policy and their impact on the Trump business in Turkey. First with the promotion of Trump Towers in Turkey with the apparent support of Erdogan and people close to him. Then the president-elect announcing a Muslim ban and the Erdogan government threatening to take the Trump names off the buildings. Then compliments by the president-elect of the Erdogan regime and the effort to remove the names somehow going away. Then the incoming national security advisor writing an op-ed on the day of the election saying we should turn over Gulen without even seeing any of the evidence to warrant extradition, someone who also has business interests in Turkey. How does Congress get to the bottom of these potential conflicts of interest? We're in the minority. We may or may not have the cooperation of those in the majority in doing so. You talked about the necessary and proper clause. What vehicles do we have even to expose the potential conflicts of interest, let alone address them?
First, you need to make it clear to the president that this body expects him to comply with the Constitution. You mentioned that Muslim ban. I mean, that is a clear confrontation with the First Amendment of the Constitution, and he knew it when he said it. And that's the kind of thing we cannot tolerate from a president, whether it's the First Amendment, whether it's the 14th Amendment, whether it's the Emoluments Clause, taking payoffs from foreign governments. And make it very clear that the House of Representatives is not going to tolerate that from any government official. And you're going to do what you're going to have to do if this type of conduct continues while he's in office. And you do have the right to, of course, see his financial disclosure form. The problem is he doesn't have to file one until May of 2018 under the law. Every other president has filed Form 278 their first year in office. President Bush did. In May of the first year of office, so did President Obama. So we ought to see, we the American people are entitled to see that Form 278 this next May be filed by President Trump. We should see his tax returns just like every other president. I have suggested that if the tax returns are not produced, that we ought to amend the statute and require that that Form 278 include a specific schedule that lists sources of income from outside the United States. Russia, here's everything I get from Russia, whether through some New York LLC or whatever. Here's everything I get from Russia. Here's everything I get from China. And right on down the list, and I would require that to be filed by everybody who is responsible in senior positions for our national security. We, the American people, are entitled to know through public disclosure, and then the House of Representatives can do with that what they will.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Congressman Cummings. I really appreciate you bringing us together on this very important topic, and I want to thank the panelists for your expertise and perspective. Accountability is the terra firma upon which the democracy's built, our democracy in particular. And people have an expectation that there will be accountability, which is at the center of what we're talking about today. But I want to lead with the perspective I think the American people are bringing to this, as expressed in the recent election. Donald Trump said to people, I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to drain the swamp. And a lot of the people who supported him had the expectation that that's exactly what he would do. He would come here and he would make sure that special interests didn't have undue influence, that he would, quote, clean the place up and so forth. The first opportunity he has to meet the expectation, the rightful expectations that Americans have, that he will do that he will carry out that desire on their part, is to fix these conflicts of interest. He needs to take that deadly seriously. I think it's at the core of the credibility of his presidency. Because he made a promise to people that that's what he was about. He said to them at the convention, I'm your voice. I'm going to go there and I'm going to look out for you. Well, here's his opportunity to do that. To say the first thing I'm going to do to show that I'm serious about cleaning up government and having transparency and accountability is I'm going to make sure none of my own business dealings create a conflict. And that's what we're talking about. This is not a partisan thing. I mean, we unfortunately don't have any Republicans here today. They were invited by Congressman Cummings to be here. So then it forces us to somehow take on a partisan aspect, but this is not partisan. The expectations I just talked about that Americans have of how their government will work and how the president will behave and how the office of the presidency will be protected and have integrity to it, those are expectations that cut across our electorate and are not determined by the political stripe that people wear. So what we're trying to do is help this president meet an expectation that he has created in Americans of all political stripes that he will adhere to the highest ethical standards, that he will undo these special interest entanglements, that he will avoid even the whiff of public corruption, because that's what our presidency deserved. Now, let me ask you this question. I know that under the law, I believe, his cabinet appointments are required to divulge certain information, to take certain actions with respect to their own assets, which are fairly dramatic. And I'm curious to hear you talk about what those are and compare them to the standard that we're expecting this president will adhere to as well. For example, one of his cabinet appointments, and I think there's 5 billionaires in there now, and other assorted multi-millionaires who are part of his cabinet, which, you know, I think is interesting given this pledge to be the voice of the American people. But one of them, I think Betsy DeVos, has assets totaling or wealth of some $5 billion. Now, presumably, she's going to have to take some very important steps to address that. What are those standards and requirements, and how do they compare to what we're asking of the president-elect? I'll start with you.
You know, the conflict of interest statute applies to all of his appointees. The problem is, and what that statute says, is that they cannot participate personally and substantially in a matter in which they have a private financial interest, unless they are exempted for some reason by an advice or a categorical exemption. The problem is that violation of those rules, or the government ethics rules, will come from appointees of the president. That is, enforcement of the rules will come from presidential appointees. So we have to rely on the Attorney General, we have to rely on appropriate administrative agencies to enforce those rules against the appointees. What you can do, of course, is publicity. If you have the cooperation of the majority, you can hold hearings and disclose what decisions were made in violation of the conflict of interest rules or ethics rules in administrative law.
It's interesting, because a moment ago when you were talking about Donald Trump's children, you suggested that they ought to be guided by, I think you said, self-restraint and decency, and I would add to that common sense. And you're now suggesting or implying that that's the kind of expectation we should have of cabinet appointees in terms of enforcing some of these standards, rules, and requirements. It indicates that we've got a whole potential for various foxes being put in charge of various hen houses here. But again, there are things that can be done. Ambassador Eisen?
Thanks, Congressman Sarbanes. One, these individuals with high net worth, when they present conflicts, are expected, if it creates a conflict, one option is to divest. Unfortunately, the president-elect seems to be headed, that means sell. The president-elect seems to be signaling he's not going to go that route. Another option is to recuse. Well, that's not an option for the President of the United States. Say, oh, I can't work on that issue. Can you imagine? There's an international crisis. They come running in the Oval Office and says, oh, I better not work on that because I have a conflict. A third option is to do a true qualified blind trust. And sometimes it's a combination of these menu items. He seems to be resisting that because he doesn't want an independent trustee. He just tweeted his kids are going to run his businesses. It's not too late for him to change course. And we have seen, the polls I've read, he started out at 50% a couple weeks ago, and he dropped down to 42. There was one today where he's at 37, contiguous with this conversation about conflicts and about Russia. And so he has proven himself to be sensitive to public opinion, and I hope that he will reverse course and do what everybody's asking him to do on both sides of the aisle. The Russia question is a very serious one as it intersects with this, because it's not just Donald Trump. He's nominated Secretary of State who has very profound business ties and personal ties to Russia and Mr. Putin. We don't know, because he hasn't released his taxes, we don't have the plethora of forms that indicate foreign entanglements. And to be candid, we've had an attack on our country. It appears, it's alleged, an attack on our most sacred heart of our democracy, our electoral system. So this puts together a set of issues, the conflicting statements Congressman Conley mentioned, which Professor Painter and I have written about on Russia, that puts an extra a level of urgency around the questions you raise.
Say that the statute to which you refer, 18 United States Code 208, is a criminal statute. There's a public integrity division of the Justice Department, and certainly during the Bush administration, the message is very clear. You violate that statute, you will be prosecuted. This is not a political judgment call, and I would expect that that issue should be raised in the confirmation hearings for Senator Sessions to make absolutely sure that that division is free of political influence, along with the Office of Legal Counsel. We're not going to have torture memos being written about the Emoluments Clause. We're fed up with that kind of thing. So we expect an independent Justice Department to enforce the law. And people take it seriously. They sell stock. And indeed, Congress has provided that there's a capital gains tax deferral. Hank Paulson sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Goldman Sachs stock. I was there in the White House working on that. Got a certificate of divestiture from the Office of Government Ethics. You can postpone your capital gains tax. So there's all sorts of combination out there. And the notion that New York lawyers and investment bankers can't get rid of the Trump business empire at a profit, I mean, that's just absolute rubbish. I do want to emphasize it's going to have to be sold. There's confusion about this blind trustee. It could be sold first, and then the money given to the blind trustee, or it could be given to the blind trustee, and the blind trustee sells it. But the business empire is going to have to be sold if the president is going to be able to be free of conflicts of interest, or we're going to have a disaster on our hands.
I want to yield my time back, but I just wanted to punctuate what you said, Ambassador Eisen. Fundamentally, this is a question of whether Donald Trump is going to put his presidency first or his business first. And I think the polls that you just alluded to indicate clearly that Americans are expecting him to put the presidency above his business. And every day that goes by that he indicates he's not interested in that, I think he does so at his peril, and he is failing in meeting the expectation that many people put in him during the campaign. I yield.
I'm going to just ask a few questions here. One of the things that I've said over and over again is that I believe that at this moment we are in a struggle for the soul of our democracy. And listening to you gentlemen here today, it just reiterates it. I've said many times to reporters that one of the reasons why we wanted to raise this on a bipartisan basis and raise these issues early is because we wanted to avoid some problems in the future. And as I listen to you all, I want to go to the date of January 20th. That's the day, of course, that President-elect is sworn in. Tell me, what is the significance if things are done before that date or after? And you, Professor Gillis, talked about it might take 6 months to wind things up, but can you all help me with that date? So on one side of the date, I guess we are still in a sort of twilight zone, but once you hit that date, certain things happen, is that right? Once he's sworn in.
Here are the risks. There's the constitutional risk of emoluments. There are any foreign government payments flowing into the Trump Business Organization. He's a violation of the Constitution on day one. So that problem absolutely has to be resolved. There is a global security risk if we have the president's name up on buildings. That exists right now. I hope President Obama is taking appropriate measures to make sure that we do not have Trump installations around the globe subjected to terrorist attack. To the extent we can control that, working with foreign governments, that's going to be a vast expense. So that risk is right now. The quid pro quo problem. Anytime anyone combines discussion of Trump business with official United States government business, there's a risk of the inference of a quid pro quo, which is solicitation of a bribe. We cannot have a situation where a foreign diplomat calls up the president-elect or anyone else to try and conduct relations with the United States, and the question comes up, well, how about those ugly windmills that are too close to the golf course? Whoever goes down that road with those types of conversations could get themselves in a situation where they appear to be soliciting a bribe. Obviously, after January 20, people are now in power, and that could be a lot more powerful, more convincing criminal case that could be started if someone started talk quid pro quo. We've got a whole range of problems that exist right now. They're going to be a lot worse after January 20. Of course, he may take some time to sell off some of the businesses, and we'll just have to live with the risks until he does. But I hope it's as soon as possible.
Yeah, I want to argue for pragmatism. We can't tell him to have a fire sale. I mean, that would be wrong. So we will have to live with several months of emolument clause violation. One antidote is for Mr. Trump to put all of his profits from foreign government expenditures that he is entitled to by virtue of his own investments into some charitable entity. I mean, if he is not profiting at all during that interval, that's a solution. But frankly, you know, if Mr. Trump said today, I will completely divest before summer, I'll take it. And I'll live through the interval happily.
I'd just as soon see him start the process. As a technical matter for any other appointee, this would not relieve of the conflicts, but it would be a huge message to the American people and to the world if he signed that piece of paper. I'm appointing an independent professional as a trustee. Take everything, sort it out, and I'm going to focus on the business of the United States now. He can do it with the stroke of a pen. He can do it today. And that's a simple way to address the January 20 problem. Otherwise, we're going to be in this extraordinary situation of immediate constitutional violation as soon as the president takes the oath of office. If he doesn't take remedial measures, that is unprecedented in the history of the United States.
Well, Ambassador Eisen, I want to just follow up on some of the things that you were talking about when you were talking about the Russian situation. I agree with you that there are those who are arguing that there's question as to what the Russians were trying to accomplish, what their motives might have been. My position has been clear. The mere fact that we know it happened is enough that should alarm every single American because it affects all of us. But let me go to Los Angeles Times a while back had a statement, and it said, I quote, Trump has sought and received funding from Russian investors for his business ventures, especially after most American banks stopped lending to him following his multiple bankruptcies. Now, Mr. Painter, how should Congress obtain the details about Mr. Trump's funding from Russian investors?
Well, you would get a lot of it from the tax returns. The problem is that he has to agree, like every other president, to make that information public. If he does not, I have urged that there be an amendment to the financial disclosure rules as I outlined, where you specifically say this is what I am getting in terms of income, this is what I owe to people in Russia, directly or indirectly. I don't care if the debt's at the corporate level or at the personal level. And by the way, in the current 278, it's only the personal debt that is disclosed. The debt at the corporate level doesn't have to be disclosed, and that's where the real estate people put most of their debt because they don't want to be personally liable. So we don't know who is owed what. It's not on that 278. We don't know by country I think you may end up having to amend the disclosure statutes if it comes to that. But the president should be voluntarily disclosing what every other president has, which is his tax returns, and we would know that information if we had the tax returns. And the American people entitled that information as well.
You know, if you're looking for remedies, you can't require the president to come to Congress and testify, but you can require all of his executives and the Trump organization to come to Congress and testify. You can ask them about those questions.
Well, we were trying to do that. That's one of the things that we had asked Chairman Chaffetz to do, to bring folk in so that we could begin to address these things early, and we haven't heard from him. There's also been reports that Donald Trump met personally with Tadrik Arif, a former Soviet-era official who founded the Bayrock Business Group. In a deposition, President-elect Trump said that he discussed with Mr. Arif, and I quote, numerous deals all over the world, end of quote. He said Mr. Arif brought Russian investors to meet with him, and I quote, Bayrock knew the people, knew the investors, and in some cases, I knew they were friends of Mr. Arif, end of quote. The New York Times goes on and it reported that recently released court records show that once Bayrock official, and I quote, brokered a $50 million investment in Trump Soho 3 other Bayrock projects by an Icelandic firm preferred by wealthy Russians, quote, in favor with President Putin. So, Professor Gillers, do you know any of the details behind this $50 million investment? Do you think we in Congress have an obligation to find out?
No, yes. I don't know the details, but yes, I do think you have an obligation to find out.
Okay. According to Time magazine, Donald Trump has boasted about how many meetings he has had with Russian oligarchs. During one trip to Moscow, he bragged that they all showed up to meet him. He stated, and I quote, almost all of the oligarchs were in the room, end of quote. There are many more reports just like this one. For example, according to the Washington Post, when Donald Trump built a tower in Panama, his clients were also wealthy Russians. My final question is this. I don't know why the president-elect is bending over backwards to protect and defend Russia and Mr. Putin, and I have no idea why he's attacking our own American intelligence officials at the same time. But isn't it now up to us in Congress to track down each and every one of these reports?
Absolutely, and if you could get the majority to join you in hearings, that would be wonderful. I think it is your duty. What you do with the information, you may disagree with each other, but getting the information, I think, is critical.
The great strength of American democracy is that the people rely on you for leadership, but we don't count on you to do everything. And this is an opportunity where we'll be able to work. Watchdog groups, the bipartisan coalition that Professor Painter and I are part of, journalists, the media, a lot of people in the United States and all over the world are looking into these questions. And I think just the fact that you brought us together today, and I really do want to thank you, Congressman Cummings, thank all your colleagues, and having the conversation is an incredible public oversight. And the ultimate court is going to be the court of public opinion. And I think we can expect, if Donald Trump doesn't do the right thing, and I fervently hope he does, that these allegations are going to be explored, more are going to come up, there's going to be a steady stream of these stories, we're going to see new revelations, every decision is going to have the overhang of conflict and personal interest. It just doesn't make sense, so let's hope the president-elect is watching and does the right thing.
Can I just echo that? Because we should remember that the antidote is not only within government. Of course, it is within government, but it's also within the watchdog groups, and even more so, perhaps, in the media and investigative reporting, who will hear things under promises of confidentiality that can get reported and exposed.
You see, one of the biggest problems is that, people will look at this, and I think Mr. Sarbanes talked about this, and it's something that I think all of us are very sensitive to. People will look and say, well, this is a partisan thing. And what we're trying to do is break through that, because this is not, again, like I said, this is not just about this moment. This is about generations yet unborn and what kind of democracy we will hand to them, and the rule of law, and making sure that people, all of us, obey the law. So it makes it very difficult when, and I can imagine people sitting back right now saying, oh, they're just messing with President-elect because he won. And how do we break through that? Because to me, that is very, very important to help people see the bigger picture.
Conflicts of interest have consequences. We've learned that from our history. One of the things that I find shocking is that a number of President-elect Trump's defenders have said, well, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson left the plantations in the hands of their families and went off to serve as president. And I would come back and say, well, perhaps that's the point. That was probably one of the most tragic conflicts of interest in American history, that our founders, including members of Congress, failed to resolve the slavery question at the outset, and we had a bloody civil war, 500,000 Americans losing their lives, and the consequences of that conflict of interest to this day. Conflicts of interest for government officials, including the president, who's the most powerful person in our government, have serious consequences. And another period of our history I already alluded to, there were many prominent business people who had investments in Europe, including in Germany in the 1930s, who did not want us to get involved with dealing with a foreign dictator. I am very thankful that at least President Roosevelt was not one of them, but there was a lot of pushback because of conflicts of interest of people who were supporting politicians who said, stay out of it, we have too much money at stake, we're making too much money off of Germany. This is a situation that could be very serious, and I look at this map up here and think, this is the man who ran against globalization. What's going on here? The whole thing makes no sense, but again, a very tragic outcome if we don't deal with it.
We're going to have just a second round, but it's going to be a little brief. But and I really want to thank you all for your patience. Ms. Conley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cummings. Again, in the category of what could go wrong with that, I'm going to start with you, Professor Gillers. I think your suggestion that we're going to have to live with the suspension of the emoluments clause of the Constitution of the United States is a slippery slope. What could go wrong with that? Well, I could maximize my profits while I can. As president, me, my family, my corporation, let's get in there and just milk it for all it's worth before the curtain comes down. I would suggest to you that's what could go wrong with that. And I also don't like the idea that we're going to be in the business of cherry picking what parts of the Constitution we're going to adhere to. I mean, while we're at it, why not suspend the First Amendment for a few months? Like professors like you can't come here and speak your mind. So I urge you to reconsider that position, because that's not, to me, an answer. The answer is much more in the category of Ambassador Eisen, which is what's stopping you from naming someone tomorrow morning. Congress would certainly support that, because you are no longer even focused or distracted by that. But to leave this cloudy and unresolved for any period of time after he's sworn in, I think is the road to perdition. And the irony here is, he may be riding high right now because he's just got elected. But, popularity fades, support fades. Political support up here is fickle. You run into trouble, especially with respect to the Constitution, and there may not be a lot of defenders. Richard Nixon could tell you a lot about that if he was still here. So, just sorry, but I urge you strongly to think about that. But I'm going to only ask one question. This one, in the category of what could go wrong with that, looking at that map, by the way, except for all those countries, he is against globalization.
He was.
Yeah, that was irony. All right, let's take the Philippines. We've talked about Russia, we've talked about Turkey, but let's talk about the Philippines. So right now, we're almost completing the Trump Tower in Makati City, which is being managed by a man named Jose Antonio, who's the head of something called Century Properties. It's going to have the Trump name on it, and the agreement is that there'll be an upfront payment of 25% of the developer's revenue year after year. There'll be an upfront payment and then 25% of revenue for year after year for the privilege of that Trump name being on these condominiums at Makati City. And keep that name in mind, Jose Antonio. Now in May, the Philippines had an election. And they elected a man named Rodrigo Duterte, who promptly set out to put distance between himself and the United States and flirted with China. But he also ran a very controversial campaign. And this is not speculation. He did this, and took credit for it. He championed the killing of suspected criminals, and street children by vigilante death squads. In 2015, he said that if he became president, up to 100,000 people suspected of links to illegal drugs could be killed. Months after his election, Duterte said he was eager to lead a genocide of up to 3 million drug addicts. Quote, "I'd be happy to slaughter them," he said. "At least if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have me," unquote. In September, before a Philippines Senate committee hearing, a hitman testified that Duterte had presided over a similar killing campaign when he was the mayor of Davao City in the Philippines. Now, Duterte had a conference call, or a congratulations call, with the president-elect after the president-elect's election on November 8th, this man. And the president said he was doing a great job and invited him to the White House. An invitation not yet extended to the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Trudeau, or to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Ms. May. And interestingly, that name, remember Jose Antonio, head of Century Properties, which is managing the Trump Tower name, has been named by Duterte, the president of the Philippines, as a special government envoy to the United States. Now, we're talking about conflicts of interest. And we're talking about a very volatile relationship with a very volatile and dangerous character who got himself elected president of the Philippines. How do we separate if Donald Trump does not divest himself of investments like the one he's got in the Philippines? How in the world can any of us reasonably separate our policy with respect to this gentleman, the president of the Philippines, and that country, from Donald Trump's exposure, financial exposure to investments in the Philippines? Especially given the fact that obviously Duterte recognizes the importance of that relationship by naming none other than the business partner in this enterprise in Makati City, Jose Antonio, as a special envoy to the United States.
You can't separate policy from conflict of interest if the president insists on keeping his conflict of interest. And this is an old problem of people saying it's fine to have foreign dictators in power so long as everybody's making a lot of money at the top 1% or higher than that. And we're going to tolerate foreign dictators, whether in Latin America, or in the Philippines, or in Germany during the 1930s. So long as we're making money. That was Henry Ford's attitude. But we cannot have people in positions of power in our government who have those financial conflicts of interest. Because if we don't stand up to dictator now, and that is where the Philippines is going. They are, if this keeps going on in the Philippines, they are gravitating toward a dictatorship. And if we don't deal with it now, the Philippines is a country we've had a close relationship with, we're going to pay a big price later on. And we do not want to do that.
Ambassador Eisen, and then I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Cummings.
In corruption theory, Congressman, there's a supply side and there's a demand side. And the Philippines situation illustrates the obvious overture that is being made. This gentleman is being chosen solely to appeal to his relationship with Mr. Trump and his business interest with Mr. Trump. It seems unlikely that the individual would be selected as special envoy absent that. So it's the dangling of an offer. And of course, the demand side.
If I could just interrupt, we're not speculating this could happen. This has happened.
He has been appointed as the special envoy. So it's troubling, and it is a sign of things to come, because the rest of the world will fall all over themselves to find ways to appeal to Mr. Trump's commercial interests as long as he maintains a financial connection. That's why he has to unload. And by the way, we're here at an extraordinary moment because, as you well know, the panel has been involved in discussing it. 2 government agencies, soon to be responsible and answerable to Mr. Trump, within the past 24 hours have told him that he must both exit his operations and his ownership interests. First, the Office of Government Ethics last night in a letter that was released, and then today, GSA. Congress released the statement of GSA as to the hotel here in Washington, D.C. He must do both in order to remove these types of unseemly, unsavory, corrupt-looking situations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plaskett.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Painter, this morning I'm sure you might have been aware that a letter was sent by Ranking Member Cummings and Representative Connolly to the General Service Administration, GSA, about Donald Trump's lease with the federal government for the hotel here in Washington, D.C. In that letter, these gentlemen have provided GSA a synopsis of a briefing that they had with us. They provided a briefing to the staff of the Oversight Committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. And during the briefings, GSA confirmed the things that we've been warning about. And that is that President-elect Trump will be in breach the moment he walks into the Oval Office unless he completely and fully divests himself of all ownership interests in the lease. The lease states very clearly, it appears, that no elected official can be a party to any share or part of the lease, and I quote, to any benefit that may arise. GSA has rejected the argument that some have tried to make, claiming that this prohibition doesn't apply to Mr. Trump because he is elected after the lease was signed. GSA has rejected that out of hand. And so, Mr. Pater, according to the non-political career individuals, contracting officials at GSA, the argument that Donald Trump, that he can continue to own companies but let his sons run the business, that's plainly wrong. Do you agree or disagree with that?
It seems to me that he's in breach of the lease. I used to live in New York, and we all knew what Donald Trump would do if a tenant was in breach of a lease. And it seems to me that that's what the United States government may have to do. This lease, as I understand it, will not permit him to receive any of the payments, profits from this hotel if he is holding public office, including President of the United States. He's not going to be able to argue around this saying, well, the presidency is different. This one I don't think he can get around. If he's in breach of the lease, then out they go.
Well, he could, as opposed to them removing him, because it says that no elected official, he could sell or otherwise dispose of his ownership. Would that be correct as well?
If he wants to, he ought to sell that hotel.
His shares within the hotel, correct?
His shares in the company that owns the hotel. He ought to sell along with the rest of this global empire. And I think some good New York lawyers and bankers could figure out a way for him to get the couple of billion he says he's worth, unless he's not worth what he says he's worth. But whatever it's worth, he can get, and they can figure out a way to get it. But he needs to sell that hotel. If he owns that hotel, we're going to have this problem under the lease, and we're also going to have the Emoluments Clause problem, because all the foreign diplomats are booking up rooms there to try and impress the president, which is exactly what the founding fathers didn't want going on. He's got to sell the hotel.
Well, he would be sharing his lease in the hotel, but Ambassador, I wanted to ask you a question as well. According to GSA, Mr. Trump currently owns close to 68% of his company's interest in the hotel lease. And even if he were to completely divest himself of all ownership, and therefore he would cure the breach of the lease itself, but he still faces major problems if his children are also running the business. Federal procurement expert Stephen Schumer and Daniel Gordon explained, and I'm going to quote them, having the president's adult children negotiate with the staff of the president's appointee at GSA presents what any reasonable person would view as an appearance of a conflict of interest. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I do agree that there's a profound challenge that is posed by the children's involvement in the businesses, and it's a challenge, unfortunately, despite the best efforts of those on both sides of the aisle, and the push for the blind trust solution has come not just from me, but my colleague Professor Painter, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Peggy Noonan, many other conservatives. And unfortunately, the situation has been exacerbated by the presence of the children in the transition. They're on the board of the transition, they've been in the meetings, they've been in phone calls. What on earth are they thinking?
Well, Ambassador, what would you think of the fact that GSA, in the lease, the primary point of contact at the Trump Organization for the hotel over the past several years has been Ivanka Trump?
It's all the more reason. This, again, is a common phenomenon around the world. I saw this as an ambassador, and I'm so sad that it's come to my own country. In China, they call them the princelings. And the kids are used as a vehicle, a conduit to influence the parents all over the world. This is why we have to go to the simple solution right away. Donald Trump needs to make a clean break, not just on operations, but on interests. He needs to turn it all over to a trustee, let the trustee deal with it, and the kids have no place in the transition or in the government. You know, it gets even worse, Congresswoman, because there's been rumors that the president-elect is trying to find a way to get a job for his son-in-law in the White House. That is in direct contravention of the U.S. anti-nepotism laws. So the situation with the kids is very troubling. In government, we avoid problems. I was very proud, on behalf of President Obama, to be charged with him with setting up the systems and procedures and the rules to prevent scandals in the White House. And folks on both sides of the aisle agree that it's been the most scandal-free White House in modern history. How did we do that? Bright, clear lines, big, beautiful walls, ethics walls, and the mingling of these kids in the government business and in the transition and in the private business of the Trump Organization is just unacceptable.
Well, I wheel back my time, and I want to thank you, Mr. Cummings, Mr. Connolly, for this hearing. I'm sure that within the transition, there are individuals who will hear and listen to this and heed the warnings that we have. Thank you.
Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings, and I want to pick up, Ambassador, on a couple of points that you made, and I really appreciate your drawing our attention to the example of the princelings around the world, a phenomenon I'm also familiar with, and I think a great sound of the alarm in terms of the potential for abuse with the current president-elect and his family if we're not careful. You also mentioned the court of public opinion being an important factor here. This gets back to something Mr. Cummings was talking about, how the public perceives this whole debate. I would venture to say that most Americans and most members of Congress have never discussed the emoluments clause, probably weren't aware there was an emoluments clause in the Constitution. So when this becomes an issue, as indeed it looks like it will on day one, the country will be forming its first impression of what does this really mean. The president-elect on many issues, for example, his the whole Russian hacking, his close ties to Russia, his fondness for Vladimir Putin, makes the argument that, well, the American people in the election, they knew about this and they voted for me, therefore it's an affirmation of my views of Russia and my conflicts with Russia. My own personal feeling is the American people that supported Mr. Trump did so despite his fondness for Vladimir Putin, not because of it. But he makes the same argument with his business interests. American people knew I have far-flung business interests. That's part of the reason they voted for me. I'm a successful business person. I would expect that the American people also thought that the president-elect would abide by the Constitution if elected. But we, I think, are seeing right now among our colleagues in the GOP an unwillingness to grapple with this issue. They are running away from it as fast as they can. Our Speaker Ryan doesn't want to talk about it. Mr. Cummings' counterpart, who has run very aggressive investigations, doesn't want to even look at this. You know, the same folks that wanted to have an investigation every time Hillary Clinton sneezed don't think there's anything to see here. There's nothing to see here. Now that may change when the conflicts become that much more apparent or flagrant. But right now, it's, I think, very difficult to both explain to the public what's implicated here in something called the Emoluments Clause. And the thing that really concerns me is that we not have this binary choice once the president-elect is sworn in, with no other mechanism than removal from office to deal with the Emoluments Clause. And so what guidance would you give are there any actions short of viewing this through the prism of does this constitute a high crime or a misdemeanor? Are there other ways to insist upon an ethical administration? And by the way, Ambassador, I just want to once again acknowledge, which I think something has escaped the attention of most American people, how rare it is for a president in the second term in the last week's administration to have been so free of any ethics problems. It is really a remarkable tribute to the president and his whole team. But we're about to have a very sharp contrast with some real ethical problems on day one of the incoming administration. But how do we confront this in a way that doesn't immediately thrust us in the specter of a nuclear option or no recourse?
Congressman, on your first question, the election was a choice between two individuals. It was not a referendum in which the American people said, I want to have the president's daughter in the meeting with the first head of state who's coming in, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, at the same time that she's doing business in Japan. That is not what the American people endorsed. As the panel noted earlier, this was, election was run on a slogan of drain the swamp. And that's what they voted for. There was the president-elect, when he was candidate Trump, repeatedly said he would address this, and it's time for him to address it. The drain the swamp issue, moving to the bipartisan question and the enforcement questions, I do believe that there is a bipartisan perspective that is forming. I listed some of those who called for the simple blind trust solution. I was proud yesterday with a leading adversary of Secretary Clinton, someone with whom I do not agree on a lot of issues. We agreed with Mr. Schweitzer on 5 points to drain the swamp, and proud that in the Washington Post we wrote that that includes the blind trust solution, it includes the tax release. So I think you're going to see a growing bipartisanship that will come to the Hill eventually, particularly if these poll numbers continue to plummet from 50 to 42 and now today to 37 or 38 as the conflicts and Russia issues are swirling. In terms of remedies, there is a concept of competitor standing, where the D.C. Circuit held in the Mendoza case that competitors who are injured can bring a case. In that case, it was goat herders who were upset about something the Labor Department was doing. They felt that they were injured. Here, the people are taking a very hard look at this in the courts, and there's a variety of other ways to do it as well, other causes of action. Is there a competitor standing civil suit for when you have one competitor the Trump Hotel, that's being favored by these huge flows of emoluments pouring in from all the embassies in Washington, from governments all over the world, sucking those monies out of other businesses in and around the Trump Hotel and the greater DC area. And this is not the only place where emoluments, just think of them as benefits. So there'll be a series of other things that can be done. And I believe in the bipartisan nature when America is confronted with a crisis. I do think we're in an urgent situation, and I do believe that your colleagues will slowly come around to work with you on these issues. I hope so.
Let me ask one last question, and that is not about the president-elect, but about one of his nominees, Rex Tillerson. This is someone who has advocated against sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine because Exxon has had a profound, perhaps $500 billion interest in doing away with these sanctions. Mr. Tillerson has, I understand, over 200 million of Exxon stock himself. I assume that he will, if confirmed, would divest himself of that stock. Is that the only issue, though? Is it merely a question of whether he can have the credibility and independence to do the job from that background, because he would be going from a position of advocating against the sanctions to advocating for the sanctions, but also he would be effectively advocating against the interests of the company he spent his entire career with, as well as his friends and colleagues with that company. Does that rise to the level of conflict of interest, or does that simply rise to the issue of whether he can do his job adequately to be confirmed by the Senate?
It's a very profound set of inquiries that you raise. The evaluation of any Secretary of State is one of the most important jobs in government after President, Vice President. I had the privilege of participating in the vetting of all of our cabinet officials. You always want to ask these questions. There are a set of technical, legal, and we talked about them. You can divest your stock options. He might lose a lot of money if he has to step away. You can find other solutions. Government can issue waivers. You can use blind trust for some things. You can recuse. It would be tough for Mr. Tillerson to recuse from all the Exxon issues. He's going to have to step away financially. He's going to have to make a clean break, I believe. And then there's another level of inquiry where you ask, and this is what in the Senate, more hope for bipartisanship. We're seeing bipartisan agreement now in the Senate on the Russia issue, that this attack on our nation's democracy, on our electoral processes must be investigated in a bipartisan way. The senators are going to look Mr. Tillerson in the eye. He's a very effective CEO, and he has a wonderful life story, and I admire the way he rose up at Exxon, and admire the way he's managed that company. He's done some good things, climate change, carbon tax, Paris Accords. But the senator's going to have to look him in the eye and say, somebody so close to Russia, a personal friend of Putin, the pictures of Mr. Tillerson with the medal from Vladimir Putin on his chest, and the two of them looking at each other with such fondness. And in a time when Russia is alleged to have attacked us, that context, and when you have a president whose son has said, we have the Russian assets, it's important, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read you exactly what his son said. In 2008, Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of our assets, and we see a lot of money pouring in from Russia. And then you have the father saying, the president-elect, I have no business there and no loans from Russia. Well, which is it? And you have no tax returns to evaluate the president-elect's ties to Russia. So you have a confluence of questions. I do not want to prejudge the conflicts issues, the actual conflicts, the appearance of conflicts, the Russia connections, and I'm not judging in any way Mr. Tillerson's decency as a human being. But I think these are very profound questions. I can say, as a foreign policy person who worked in that part of the world, and I saw all the dirty tricks that Russia used, the fake news, the use of cyber hacking, the intrusion on all their neighbors, the assertion of their naked interference with the political affairs of their neighbors, that this is a very important set of questions that you are raising. I'm eager myself, as both an ethicist and an American, to know the answers that the Senate will get.
As we go to Mr. Sarbanes, we remind the panel, I promised the gentleman that we'd be out of here by 3, and we will. Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Are any of you familiar with the Stock Act that was passed with great fanfare here? So I'd just like you to speak to that momentarily if you could, because that's a piece of legislation which expressly prohibits the president from using non-public information for personal gain. So first off, do you agree that it applies to the president as you read it?
It does. And so does the insider trading law that existed before the Stock Act was enacted. And this would apply to the president and everybody else. And I am concerned about the tipping off of people about confidential United States government information. There's a hedge fund operator who is very close, I believe, to Mr. Bannon, who's going into the White House. And the Supreme Court just last week decided an insider trading case, the Salmon case, and the Supreme Court favored a broad interpretation of Section 10b, Rule 10b-5, the insider trading laws. You tip off someone who's a close personal friend, that could be confidential information. That could be a violation of these are criminal statutes if it's insider trading in public securities markets. But there are broader conflict issues as well under the Stock Act. This issue needs to be taken very seriously. It has not received as much attention as some of the other conflicts.
And presumably that's where his children, again, get tangled up in the analysis.
If they are getting confidential United States government information, non-public information, and they are going into the securities markets, there's going to be a big mess. I mean, that would be, I think, a violation of the insider trading laws. And this is a serious risk when we have people sitting in on meetings who are not United States government employees just because they happen to be related to the president. I'm very concerned about it.
I want to try to be the first person on the panel, Mr. Chairman, to get in under 5 minutes and have respect here for the final round. So let me just punctuate something that's been said, because we talk about the president-elect not understanding the need to put up this boundary between his presidency and his business interests, but it's almost the reverse of that. He appears, at least based on what he's done so far as president-elect, that he views official meetings he's having as an opportunity to actually bring his business interests into the conversation. And we've almost had kind of a Cook's tour of his assets around the world based on the congratulation conversations and meetings that he's been having with various heads of state, whether it's the president of Argentina, the president of Turkey, talking to members of the British Parliament, the Japanese premier, et cetera, et cetera. So he so far is not indicating an understanding of where that line is and appears to be willfully ignoring that line. Let me just ask you each very quickly to be on the record, on a scale of 1 to 10, how diligent would you say the President-elect Trump has been in addressing these issues of a conflict of interest and ethical standards?
2.
2?
I think 2 is generous.
2 is generous? Mr. Payne?
I give them a 1 or 2. I mean, the reason is that this type of conversation, if it goes too much further, can end up being a solicitation of a bribe. I mean, you can't have a, well, you'll get this out of the United States government if I get a building permit, somewhere. You better be very careful. You cannot discuss Trump business, United States government business with the same people in the same conversations. That is entirely inappropriate, and it could be solicitation of bribe. I'd give that whole idea of that a 0.
Okay.
The problem here is, and just the elephant in the room, so to speak, is that building on what Congressman Sarbanes said, Mr. Trump may not be concerned about any of this. It concerns us. It should concern the country. But it may be that he'll do what he can get away with, that he doesn't draw a clear distinction between the business and his responsibilities to govern, and that he doesn't see that the Congress will do anything about it, or that the information that we need to evaluate his conduct will become entirely public.
Well, let me just finish then where I started, 20 seconds, which is on this topic, because I think it's Americans' interest that we're looking out for. I would say to Americans of every single political stripe, do not abandon your rightful expectation that this president will put your interests first, will put the presidency first, and will put the Constitution first above his own personal interest. That is the accountability demand that the American people are entitled to, and I thank you for your testimony here today. It was extremely helpful, and I yield back.
So many people have gone to New York to meet with President-elect Trump. Have any of you been invited?
I was in New York with Norm last Sunday, and I did tell someone with the Trump transition that I was there, and I was told that they were all up at the Army-Navy game. So I did go into the Trump Tower and had my 12-year-old son take a picture of me standing next to the elevator. So I let them know that the ethics lawyers are watching who's coming in and out of the elevator.
Have any of you all been invited?
I was invited and been written about in the papers on behalf of a group of us, including Professor Painter, into the transition, not to Trump Tower, but
Before
into
the election.
Before the election, we were invited when the transition was being headed by Governor Christie, and we had a courteous meeting with the transition, presenting some ethics ideas. We have not, since the election, heard back further, but let me say, on behalf of myself, I know I'm authorized on behalf of Professor Painter as well, and I'm sure Professor Gillers would join us, that I'm available and ready to talk about these issues with the folks who are working for the president-elect to try to get to the right place, of course. And I hope that we will, and if I may take one more second just to say, Congressman Sarbanes, the reason I don't give a 0, probably would give a 2, is because there actually have been signs that the public pressure has an effect. There were complaints that the lobbyists were overrunning the transition. Trump kicked out the lobbyists. There were complaints his kids were getting security clearances. He then said, oh, that was some intern. That same intern has been getting blamed for those security clearances since I got to Washington 25 years ago. That intern must be on Social Security by now. And then there were the issues about the nepotism, and he went to the New York Times, said, well, maybe I won't make my son-in-law my top West Wing advisor. I'll make him my floating peace envoy. He's bowed once, he's now says, well, there's a visible or visual or apparent conflicts. He bent again just now, saying in his most recent tweets, he postponed his press conference. Maybe that's a good thing. He wants to think about these problems. And he said, well, I'm going to exit from operations. I'm going to let my sons work on it. So there are these baby steps. The problem is what we need is a giant leap.
Well, Professor Gillers, have you been invited?
I stay as far away as I can from Fifth Avenue and 56th Street.
Fine. But this is my question.
No, I haven't.
I understand. If you were invited, and very briefly, tell us what your advice today. I mean, if he called right after this meeting and said, gentlemen, please come to see me tomorrow morning, what would your advice be right now?
Sell.
As a lawyer to a client, basically.
I will sell his business holdings as soon as possible for the best possible price. He's written a book called The Art of the Deal. He has lots of good people who can work for him on this, and they can figure out a way to get a good price, whether it's through an initial public offering or a sale to a private equity firm. They can figure this out. I know he didn't think he'd win this election, but he did. He's got the job he wanted. He needs to sell. He'll clear a couple of billion if he's worth what he says he's worth, and that's enough to give his kids a decent start in life. Well, he's president of the United States. Sell at a good price, and do a good job as president.
Ambassador.
Find a truly independent trustee who has an outstanding reputation, not just for doing finance, but for integrity. Call a press conference right now when we end this meeting, Mr. President-elect, and say, I am going to give all of my operational and ownership interest to this trustee to manage. I'm going to follow the blind trust model that every president has followed for the past 4 decades. The entire country and the world will breathe a sigh of relief, and maybe your poll numbers won't drop so precipitously from 50% now down to 37 or 38.
Professor Gillers.
Well, I would say the same thing, but I would also say, don't think about today. Think about your reputation in history, your legacy in 20 years. How will people look back on the Trump administration? Think about what these conflicts can do to that reputation. Because I think that might move him.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I remember a while back when we had the stimulus program under President Obama, the person who was in charge of trying to make sure that the funds were spent properly came before our committee, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, I'm going to be there because I'm going to try to make sure we avoid problems. I don't want people to get into problems. I want to avoid them. And he did a pretty good job of it. You may have been involved in that, and I think what I'm concerned about is that if things are not, first of all, a lot of it is avoidable based upon what you're saying. The question is whether the president-elect will do what all of these folks up here have been saying, and that is to choose the American people and over his company and look towards the future. And we want the future to be bright, and that's so very, very important. So, Ms. Plaskett, I'm gonna let you get the last word, and then I'll just give one sentence and we'll be finished.
I don't want to take time for the line of questioning that I had, which Professor Gillers was really related to Starrett City, which, is being from New York, the housing development of Brooklyn, which has, Mr. Trump reported that he earned about $5 million a year in rent from that, which has as a component of it an affordable housing piece, right? And we know that Mr. Trump, as president, will be electing the head of HUD, who may have policies that affect whether or not affordable housing or not will keep back. But I am of the opinion that I thank you, Ambassador, for discussing the baby steps that have been taken. And I thank you all for being here and for my colleagues who came, because I think if we continue to keep this pressure up, that additional steps will be taken, and if not a leap by him willingly, a push by the rest of us will send him over, and what should be done in the best interest of the people of the United States will take place. So, Mr. Cummings, I'm here to help you with the shoulder to make that push, to ensure that the integrity of the presidency is upheld, the integrity of the United States as a democracy is continued, so that we are the example of how good governance works. So thank you for this time.
Thank you. I want to thank, first of all, the panelists. It was very kind of you all to come at short notice. And I thank you for caring. I really do. I mean, the passion that you have displayed, and it's clear that this is bigger than you, and you understand that, and that you truly care. And we really do appreciate it very much. We appreciate all of the appearances that you all have made on television. It seems like I've gotten to know you just from watching television. But giving your opinion and being very frank, we appreciate that. To my colleagues who have taken time out of their busy schedules, I mean, a lot of people say when you're off, we aren't doing anything, but we are doing a lot usually. And so I want to thank you all for taking up time to be here. And believe me, there are many more of our colleagues who care about this issue, and I think several of you all have said it. We are hoping that they will join, Republican and Democrat. Because this is it's a big issue for all of us. And so, again, we thank you so very much, and we want to thank all of the people in the audience that took time out to be a part of what we're doing today. This is about America. This is about tomorrow. This is about generations yet unborn. Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony.
Thanks for your leadership on this and on all of our issues.
We have to, and I'm hoping that we can really.
I gotta learn from it.
People have to accept access.
Both calling out lack of accountability. And so they go together, they're two sides of the same coin. Thanks very much. Your testimony.
It's a new era of overstimulation and,
Thank you very much.
thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please do. We need help.
We're gonna work great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Under the Constitution, the only way, well, we're going to introduce it, but I mean,
I got it. Thank you very much.
you can't be
Thank you,
unmindful of the
Professor. Thank you.
Constitution.
Yeah.
You can't be
I
unmindful
did.
of
I did.
public opinion. You can lead it, but to lead it.